Music is an integral part of Titanic's story, whether it's the story of her 8 musicians and their final performance during the disaster, or the story of the pianos that were carried aboard Olympic and Titanic. But some of her passengers were also closely connected with music as part of their work. In this episode, we'll follow in the footsteps of Edwin and Susan Kimball, first-class passengers on Titanic, and we'll explore the connection between them and the Hallet Davis Piano Company. Welcome to the Steam and Splendor Network. On the morning of Wednesday, April 10, 1912, the waterfront at the White Star Dock in Southampton, England was buzzing with activity. The new White Star liner Titanic was the center of attention, a hive of activity. The first group of paying passengers that Titanic would carry were descending upon White Star Dock. Many had stayed in Southampton the previous night at local hotels. Others arrived with the boat trains that were coming in from London that morning. Among those boarding were 2 Americans from Boston, Massachusetts, 42-year-old Edwin Kimball and his wife, 45-year-old Susan. The couple was returning from a nearly 5-week vacation sightseeing in Europe, and they would be first-class passengers on the voyage. Edwin Kimball was the president of the Hallet and Davis Piano Company, based in Boston. On this subject, perhaps a little background is necessary. The latter half of the 19th century and the dawn of the 20th century had seen the American piano industry expand by leaps and bounds. It was becoming more and more common to find pianos in the homes of not just the wealthy, but also among those of more modest means. With the increasing popularity of player pianos, this expansion in the industry would continue to grow for nearly 2 decades after Titanic's maiden voyage. There were literally thousands of companies manufacturing these instruments in 1912, and each was eager to impress potential customers with the quality, beauty, or innovations of their particular pianos. The Hallet Davis Piano Company was one of the most prestigious manufacturers of the period, having been founded back in 1835. Edwin Kimball's father, Edwin N. Kimball Sr., had served as president of the firm. It was said that Edwin Jr. had devoted his whole life to the manufacture of pianos, and that he had learned the trade under his father's guidance. His father died in April 1904, and Edwin had become president of the company shortly before that, in 1900. A book on piano manufacturers described young Edwin as possessing a systematic, orderly mind for details in factory organization. It's also worth noting that there were some family connections between Edwin Kimball Jr. as he took the reins of the Hallet Davis Piano Company and the Kimball family that was behind the famous W. Kimball Piano Company of Chicago. Some of the directors of Hallet Davis who worked with Edwin, like the Conway brothers, also had strong family connections to upper-level management at the Kimball Piano Company. They'd even worked in that firm before they joined Hallet Davis. Initially born in Atlanta, Georgia, Edwin Jr. had followed his family north to Boston, where his father had become president of the company. Eventually, Edwin married Susan Gertrude Parsons in 1893, and by early 1912, the couple felt the need for a relaxing holiday. The vacation was certainly well-deserved. Edwin's company had recently seen a new factory complex built for the Hallet Davis Piano Company. The new complex was located in Dorchester, Massachusetts, near the Neponset River. The building permits for this project had been granted in 1910, and after construction of the first building of the new reinforced concrete factory, it was said that the cost, without fixtures, had been $130,000, including plumbing and downspouts. Estimates on the total cost for the complete factory had run much higher than that, but any way you slice it, these were massive expenditures in those days. In July 1911, Edwin Kimball had written a letter of recommendation to the builders of their new factory complex, saying that they highly recommended this type of building for piano manufacturers. Although they'd initially been worried that this sort of building would be overly damp, after moving in, they found that it was actually a better working environment than their old mill-constructed building was. He also pointed out in the letter that they'd even been able to move in 30 days earlier than expected. Truly, the new factory was well built. In fact, it was so well built that it remains standing today as an apartment complex, looking very much the way it did when it was finished in 1911. With this period of change settled and the new factory up and running, it was the ideal time for Edwin and Susan Kimball to vacation. Indeed, it was said that they were traveling in search of rest and a complete change. They sailed aboard the White Star liner Cedric from New York, bound for the Mediterranean on March 6, 1912. The couple stopped at Madeira and went as far as Nice in France. Over the following month, the couple toured Italy, Switzerland, France, and England. During that period, they sent postcards and letters to their friends back home in Boston, as well as to some of their employees at Hallet and Davis. Now they were returning home. Before boarding, Edwin had sent word back to his Boston office that he would be sailing aboard Titanic, and he even mentioned that it would be the monster liner's maiden voyage. The Kimballs were friends with Richard and Sarah Beckwith of New York, New York, who were also boarding Titanic that morning in Southampton, along with Sarah Beckwith's 19-year-old daughter Helen Newsom. The Beckwiths had taken young Helen on a European holiday in the hopes of discouraging her romantic attachment to a young tennis player named Carl Bear. However, Bear was not to be shaken off quite so easily. Not only had he followed Helen to Europe, but he'd also booked passage aboard Titanic. He would join the ship that evening when she called at Cherbourg, France, so that he could continue his courtship of the young lady. Edwin and Susan Kimball were booked in First Class stateroom D19. Located on the starboard side of D-deck, forward of the dining saloon, D19 would have been an interior stateroom normally. However, the stateroom was shaped like the letter L, with a side corridor wrapping around the outer stateroom, D21, leading down to the side of the ship. This allowed the Kimball stateroom, D19, the luxury of a porthole with a view to the sea. The Beckwiths were in nearby stateroom D35, and their daughter Helen was booked into inside stateroom D47. Very little information survives regarding the Kimballs' experiences from the time they boarded Titanic up until the evening of Sunday, April 14th. No doubt for them, the trip was largely similar to what so many other passengers aboard remembered about the maiden voyage, being impressed with Titanic's size and amenities, being able to spend time with their friends and make new acquaintances, and maybe enjoying the music of Titanic's band. At this point, one has to wonder if Edwin Kimball, the head of such a prestigious American piano manufacturing company, took any time to inspect the German-built Steinway pianos which had been installed aboard Titanic. Perhaps he paused to look at the Model B Grand in the first class reception room, or the Model R upright in the first class boat deck entrance. Or maybe he even spotted the beautiful Model K upright that may have been in the reception room for the a la carte restaurant aft on B deck. The story behind this latter piano is one that bears telling. When Olympic had first entered service in 1911, her restaurant had been graced with a piano. When it was removed, it was lost to history, later being replaced with a nearly identical piano in 1913, the year after Titanic sank. The original Olympic piano had likely been added to the new restaurant reception room, which had been added to Titanic. Its nearly identical replacement instrument was brought aboard Olympic the following year, and it was removed from Olympic when she left service. It was later found and restored. That 1913 instrument is the very piano that the RMS Olympic Steinway Association has spent so much time and effort trying to purchase and preserve and then to display to the public. This story is covered in another documentary on our sister network, Part-Time Explorer. If Kimball had taken the time to inspect any of these instruments, we have to wonder if he was impressed with their sound, the quality of their construction, the custom art case cabinetry which had been made to match the decor of the ship and the rooms that they were installed in. Piano manufacturers were a notoriously proud bunch with plenty of negative things to say about their competitors. The competition could, and occasionally did, get ugly. In Philadelphia in late 1878, when movers from Steinway and Weber met in the hallways of the Westminster Hotel while moving instruments for their respective firms, things had gotten very ugly. The awkward situation had devolved into an all-out battle royale where the movers from each company unscrewed the legs to the pianos that they were moving, and what was later called a battle like something out of the Middle Ages ensued. Usually the competitive streak didn't get that ugly. Still, might Kimball have found any room for improvement in their own instruments? Or did he perhaps find areas where his own firm's pianos excelled? The possibilities on this subject are intriguing, particularly to a piano technician such as myself. One way or another, the Kimballs likely found that the days of the maiden voyage passed without any serious incident. At 11:40 p.m. Sunday night, April 14th, the routine of shipboard life changed in an instant. Edwin had just returned to his stateroom, D19, from the smoking room. His friend Richard Beckwith and young Carl Baer had also been in the smoking room, and it seems that the three men had all left at nearly the same time, since all of them reached their staterooms before the collision. Standing in the middle of his room, Edwin had just removed his coat when the ship struck the iceberg. He recalled that it seemed like scraping and tearing more than a shock, and correctly identified that the collision was taking place on the starboard side of the ship beneath their stateroom. This conclusion was no doubt reinforced when ice actually came in through their stateroom porthole. Edwin assured his wife Susan that it was simply an iceberg. Then he stepped into the corridor outside their stateroom, where he spoke to some friends whose staterooms were nearby. Very likely the Beckwiths, who were in an adjacent stateroom, were in this small group. Carl Baer had also made a beeline for the Beckwiths and for Helen Newson's staterooms, and was likely also in the group that Edwin spoke with. Like many others, Edwin then went up on the boat deck to see if he could still see the iceberg. Now what's interesting is the fact that the first-hand accounts from Edwin Kimball and Carl Baer, as well as a second-hand account from Richard Beckwith, all use the word "we" when they discussed going up on deck to investigate the situation. From this, it seems likely that at least some members of this group stuck together as they went up to the boat deck. Edwin recalled,
"There were very few people out around the ship. The stewards and the officers were assuring everybody that everything was all right and telling them to return to bed, which many of them probably did."
Returning to the corridor outside his stateroom, Edwin saw an odd sight. He noticed one of the ship's mail clerks going down a set of stairs located just forward of his stateroom. This stairway led down to the squash courts and mailroom. When the mail clerk came back up the stairs, Edwin noticed that not only was he holding a mail bag in his hand, but he also noticed that the mail clerk was wet to the knees. Edwin remembered,
"I asked him how bad it was. He seemed very serious and said it was pretty bad and that he would advise the women to dress, as they might have to go on deck and it would be cold. We instructed the rest of the women in our party to dress, and also everyone else in our corridor, including a number of women who were traveling alone."
When he got back to his stateroom, he found his wife was already dressing, and he advised her to dress warmly since they might be on deck in the cold air for some time. Then he followed his own advice and donned a sweater and a heavy ulster. They were still feeling that everything was all right when they left their stateroom, but this illusion began to melt away very quickly when they heard that the order had been given to put on lifebelts. Carl Baer specifically remembered an officer whom he identified as Captain Smith giving them this order as he passed through the area. The Kimballs returned to their stateroom and put on their lifebelts. No one in the corridor knew how to put them on, but an officer came by and showed them how to do this. He also reassured them that there was no danger and that everything would be all right. The Kimballs, the Beckwiths, Helen Newsom, and Carl Baer all headed up to the boat deck as a group. They emerged onto the starboard side of the deck and found that only a few people were there. Edwin recalled that the officers were having great difficulty convincing people to get into the lifeboats. He also remembered that they were simultaneously reassuring them all that it wouldn't be long before they would probably be back on the big boat. The group watched as boat number 7 started down at about 12:40 a.m., an hour after the collision. Edwin recalled that this boat was not more than 2/3 full, and he was right. It actually carried about 28 people of its 65-person capacity. He also remembered hearing the officers say that they would have to do something to get the people started. The officers working on boat number 7 included First Officer William Murdoch, the officer of the watch when Titanic had collided with the iceberg. Third Officer Pittman was working at nearby boat number 5, just forward of number 7. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, was also nearby, and he was the one who actually ordered Pittman to begin loading boat number 5. Pittman had gone to Captain Smith for confirmation that he should indeed begin loading, and upon his return to the scene, began following that order, calling out over the thundering din of the escaping steam, "Come along, ladies." We know that as boat number 5 was loading, Thomas Andrews also passed by. Eleanor Casimir, a first-class passenger who was boarding the lifeboat, remembered seeing him as she got in. She said that she couldn't hear what he said to her because of the din, but he motioned to her to get into the boat. She asked him why he didn't also get in, but he replied, "No, women and children first." As Eleanor jumped in, she noticed Bruce Ismay helping to load women and children into the boat as well. She saw that he was dressed in pajamas and slippers, with a coat thrown over his shoulders. Edwin Kimball recalled that the men in their group decided that they would put all of the women from their group and nearby into this boat, number 5. He said,
"We not only put in all the women in our party and those we had advised to come to the boat deck, but also put in 2 stewardesses, which was all the women on the boat deck at that time. Mrs. Kimball absolutely refused to leave without me, and one of the officers and myself had to pick her up bodily and put her into the boat, together with all the other women and the 2 stewardesses."
Likely that officer was Third Officer Pittman. Edwin recalled that at that point, he stepped back onto Titanic's deck. This gets into an interesting discrepancy in the recollections about what happened. Interestingly, Carl Baer remembered things slightly differently. He recalled that Mrs. Beckwith had turned to Bruce Ismay and asked if the men in their party could board the boat. He also remembered that Ismay had replied, "Why, certainly." However, when first-class passenger Charles Stengel tried to follow his wife into this boat, those in charge of loading told him, "No, nothing but ladies and children." Charles remembered stepping back onto the deck, even as Edwin Kimball recalled doing. Stengel later boarded boat number 1 safely and survived. But here, at this point, something changed. This might have had something to do with the arrival of First Officer Murdoch on the scene. Murdoch had been overseeing work on lowering boat number 7 just aft of boat number 5. When he finished there, he moved forward to check in on things at number 5. Murdoch ordered Third Officer Pittman into number 5 to take charge of it, bade him farewell, and then moved forward to boat number 3. Pittman recalled that he jumped into the boat and ordered it lowered away. It was about 12:43 a.m. The lowering to the water did not go entirely smoothly, and shortly after the boat started down, it stopped. A young first-class passenger in the boat, Marguerite Frolicker, remembered, like Edwin, that the boat had started down with only women in it, but that it had stopped, and that a British officer had said, "Let the men in. Make haste." Her father was subsequently allowed into the boat. This might also have been the moment when Mrs. Beckwith had asked Bruce Ismay if the men in their group could board. It might also explain the variations in their recollections about what happened. Murdoch's general thinking was different from the women and children only rule which had been mentioned when Stengel had tried to board.
After it had been lowered 10 or 12 feet, one of the officers of the Titanic said to me, "There are no women on the deck, and there is more room in that lifeboat. You had better go," and gave me a rush, and I jumped and landed in the lifeboat. And I feel that I owe my life to that fact.
Incredibly, Mr. and Mrs. Kimball and Mr. and Mrs. Beckwith, as well as Carl Bear and Helen Newsom, all managed to get into a lifeboat, and not just into any lifeboat, but all got into the same one. As the lowering continued, many of the occupants remembered that one end stuck and then the other, and many of those in the lifeboat thought that they would be pitched into the water far below. The boat's passengers would then call up for the men lowering away to even things out, first one side and then the other. Fortunately, number 5 reached the water safely, but even then, there was trouble disconnecting the boat's falls. Eventually, the lifeboat got clear and rowed away. Incredibly, Edwin Kimball didn't mention seeing Titanic sink at all. However, he said that it was impossible to describe the awful tragedy. He did mention that their boat tried to stay close to some of the other lifeboats during the night. He also recalled that the next morning, they rowed toward Carpathia, where they were eventually picked up. Kimball spoke very highly of the treatment that they received while they were on board the Cunard ship. When the world learned that Titanic had sunk, friends and relatives of those who were on board Titanic were immediately anxious for word on the safety of those who they knew on board. Initially, it was thought that Edwin Kimball had perished. The names of Edwin and Susan Kimball were not contained on any of the wireless lists of survivors that were being transmitted ashore from Carpathia. However, there was reason for hope, as the names Mr. and Mrs. Ed Kimberly had been contained on these lists. Earl E. Conway, who was one of the directors of the Hallet Davis Piano Company, traveled down to New York to find out for sure whether the Kimballs were on board Carpathia and among the survivors, and if they were, to personally meet them. Once he arrived in the city, he received word that the Kimballs had been confirmed by wireless as being survivors. He quickly passed this good news on to those anxiously awaiting back in Boston. Then he went down to meet them at Cunard's Pier 54 on the west side of Manhattan. It was said that many of the Kimballs' friends in that city offered their hospitality, but the couple instead went immediately to the Hotel Belmont, where they had made reservations before embarking aboard Titanic. Mr. Conway helped them get to the hotel immediately. Mr. Kimball declined to be interviewed by reporters, saying that he was too fatigued to do so. The couple did think to send a wire to their family back home in Boston saying that they'd arrived safely and that they were in good health. The members of the Hallet Davis Piano Company were reportedly overjoyed to learn that their president had been saved. The Kimballs remained secluded in their hotel room the next morning, trying to recuperate. Mr. Conway made himself gatekeeper for the reporters who were eagerly waiting to interview the Kimballs. He told them that if they would leave him alone, he would speak to the Kimballs and get a statement for them. He did tell the reporters that Mrs. Kimball initially hadn't felt the effects of her experiences in the lifeboat, and that she was even able to help others while on board the Carpathia heading for New York. However, he said that once the strain was over, she collapsed. That afternoon, good to his word, Mr. Conway went over to his own office in New York and then released the written statement with Mr. Kimball's account. The letter that Mr. Conway released was actually addressed to Kimball's nephew, who was working in the W. Kimball Piano Company out in Chicago. Eventually, the Kimballs made their way home, where they continued to be prominent citizens of the Boston area. In the months and years afterward, Edwin Kimball occasionally found himself in the local papers for having played in a number of golf tournaments in the Boston area. There was also a touching report when he went into a bankruptcy sale of the National Piano Company. The sale included all of the company's goods, including the pianos that they still had under construction, their patents, their trade names, everything. Kimball entered the bidding and managed to win the auction for $36,000. However, instead of taking the business apart, he said that he had bought the property just to help out President A.L. Jewett. He assured everyone that the National Piano Company would continue operations under the old management and would continue to conduct business generally just as they had before. Clearly, not all competitors in the piano business viewed each other as rivals. We know that Kimball stayed on as president of Hallet Davis through 1917. However, in July 1918, when the Cunard liner Carpathia was sunk during World War I, Kimball had already left the company. However, the news reports about the loss of Carpathia, the vessel that had rescued Titanic's survivors, revived the memories of the accident among the employees in the company and even made headlines. Edwin Kimball died in April 1927, about 15 years after the Titanic disaster. His wife, Susan, passed away in March 1962, having outlived her husband by nearly 35 years. Incredibly, the Hallet Davis Piano Company outlived Edwin Kimball, although it has changed hands since 1912. The Great Depression and the popularity of the gramophone began to take a toll on the piano industry. Many of the thousands of American piano manufacturing companies went out of business altogether. Hallet Davis became part of the conglomerate Aeolian American Piano Corporation. Aeolian continued to build pianos under the Hallet Davis brand name into the 1980s. In fact, pianos continued to be sold under this legendary brand name. The pianos are now made in Asia and imported to the United States. In a sense, then, the legacy of Edwin Kimball and his family continues today in these more modern pianos. Although very few people know of the connection between these instruments and the Titanic disaster, the music, as they say, continues. A special thank you to our supporters on Patreon: Nikki Chan 92, Evan Plemming, Lucas Sidlowski, Mark Gegenheimer, Maximilian Metcalf, Rachel Warner Sanchez, and Snow Monkey.